Good evening and good afternoon to those of you who are joining us from the United States. Good morning, I guess, for those of you joining us from California. I'm Leslie. I direct the US and Americas program here at Chatham House. I'm sure by this point you're quite familiar with me, and I feel very familiar with all of you. It's really good to have such a strong turnout, despite the fact that we're doing quite a lot. I'm not surprised given the extraordinary talent that we have in our very distinguished speaker today. Let me first say that, as you all know, we are 2 weeks away from the presidential elections, the US 2020 elections, the elections of a generation that we are all watching. And, bearing in mind that we're not in the United States, that tells us a little bit about how significant these are likely to be. I think we have something, I'm sure Professor Richard Hassan will tell us, but the last I checked, there were roughly 28 million Americans who have already voted, and we are possibly on track to have the largest turnout that we've ever seen in a US presidential election, possibly between as much as 150 and 160 million, up from about 135 million in the last presidential election. Today, we are very lucky to have Professor Richard Hassan with us. He is the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at University of California, Irvine. He's currently based in Los Angeles. If you haven't read his work, you certainly should. He's published more than 100 journals, articles in law journals, law reviews. He runs the Election Law blog, which I highly recommend that you tune into. I just tweeted one of your most recent posts saying, if this election comes down to Pennsylvania, I'll paraphrase, we're in deep trouble. But most importantly, I think, is the publication of his recent book on the day of the Iowa caucuses, pre-COVID, but obviously a very important caucus and one that went terribly wrong, if you remember, in terms of the technology. The book is called Election Meltdown, and I think we will hear more about it. But it is about voter suppression and the actual reality of voting, as well as the electoral process in the United States. So Professor Hassan is going to speak to us for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we will open it up and I hope have a really engaged conversation. Your expertise is really something that we are desperate for and craving at this point in time. We get a lot of talks about America and US foreign policy, but not so much from yours with your sort of expertise. So thank you so much for joining us. We are on the record and we are recording. I'll turn it over to you now.
Well, thanks so much, Leslie. I appreciate the opportunity, and especially to speak at Chatham House and not follow the Chatham House rules. So that's striking two things off my bucket list, I guess. Let me start with a little bit of background because I know that many people in the audience are not deeply familiar with how the United States runs its elections. So let me just spend a few minutes on that and then talk about three possible scenarios for what we might see on November 4th or 5th when the election is over. So first, the most important thing to know is that the United States is not conducting a single election on November 3rd. It's not even conducting 50 or 51 elections, the 50 states plus DC. It's actually conducting something like 10,500 different elections because that's how many different electoral jurisdictions we have. We have a hyper decentralized election system in the United States down to the county or sub-county level. Many of the rules about when voting places are open, what the format of the ballot looks like, and all of these things are determined by local officials. And sometimes these local officials are partisan officials. That is, they're affiliated with one of the two parties. So the United States kind of stands alone compared to the rest of the world's advanced democracies in not using national nonpartisan election administration to run its national elections. So that leaves a lot of room for variance. It means that authority over elections in the United States is deeply fragmented. It is polarized. Many cases about elections end up in the courts. I've been tracking election litigation in the United States since 1996, and The amount of such litigation has nearly tripled in the post-2000 period after our disputed 2000 election compared to the pre-2000 period. And this election season is almost certainly going to be a record. We have over 300 court cases just involving COVID and the election that have been filed, some of which are ongoing, one of which was just decided by the United States Supreme Court last night on a tie vote. Not a very auspicious way to get the election season going. So we have fragmented authority. We have sort of weak protection for voting rights built into our Constitution that leaves room for a lot of disagreement about what the voting rules should be. We have this polarization. And of course, we're trying to conduct an election during a pandemic. And that has led to a huge shift in voting from, in many places, from mostly voting in person to an extensive use of voting by mail. And in some American states, voting by mail is very common. In 5 states, it's the primary method by which people vote. But there are some states where it's rare and being rolled out in a very major way. We'll talk a lot about Pennsylvania, I'm sure, over this hour. It's one of the places I'm most worried about. And so there are going to be issues about people being disenfranchised for not following the rules. One of the rules in Pennsylvania, for example, is that if you forget to put your mail-in ballot, your postal ballot, into an inner envelope, it's a so-called naked ballot, and your ballot won't count. And we had about 100,000 people who were disenfranchised because they didn't know this rule, because we know that first-time voters are more likely to be disenfranchised because they're not familiar with the rules. So there's now a whole public education campaign. You can go to nakedballots.org and you can see a bunch of American celebrities do a public service announcement with no clothes on to try and get people to know about how they need to clothe their ballots. So we're entering this election season on top of the polarization, on top of the pandemic and all of the changes that have come with the pandemic. We're closely divided. And so the outcome of the United States election depends upon voting by state and the District of Columbia. Whoever gets more electoral college votes, which are assigned to each state roughly based on the state's population, but not exactly. Whoever gets to 270 is the winner. If we don't get to 270, then there are all kinds of complicated and convoluted rules that could kick in that could toss the issue to the American Congress. So there's a lot of focus on the so-called battleground states, those states that are close, that might give one state, that might give one side or the other a victory. So what do I foresee on November 4th or 5th? And let me say that because we have voting by mail in large numbers in places for the first time, it may be a week or longer before we know the results in some states like Pennsylvania. Some states like Florida or other states like Colorado are pretty quick at counting absentee ballots, but places like Pennsylvania won't be. And so if the US election comes down to one of those states, we may not know the results for some time. Okay, so here are the 3 scenarios that seem the most likely. And these 3 are not in order of likelihood. They're just, I'll just put them out there as the 3 most likely. Number 1, Trump ekes out an electoral college win. That is, he finds enough states to get to 270 electoral college votes. And he still loses the popular vote in the United States by up to 5 million votes. So it's possible in the United States that 5 million more people will vote for Joe Biden over Donald Trump, but Donald Trump could still win. This would be yet another election where the popular vote winner in the United States was the Electoral College loser. In fact, only once since 1992 has a Republican captured the popular vote in the United States. That was in 2004, but yet Republicans are consistently winning election thanks to the Electoral College. I think if Trump narrowly wins this way, basing his coalition on white, older, rural voters and in kind of direct opposition to a more multicultural, eclectic American population, there's going to be a lot of anger and resentment on the American left. I don't think that would translate into violence in the streets, although there may be protests, but there will be a lot of grumbling about the process and about a system that does not follow the ideal that whoever gets the most votes wins the election. And so that makes our American presidential system different from others. So that's scenario number one. Scenario number two is that we have a Biden landslide. Some of the polling is showing Biden with a 10 or 11 point national lead and a lead in enough battleground states that Trump has a very narrow path to an electoral college victory. If the polls are accurate, then Biden could win 400 electoral college votes, something on that order. 2 weeks is still a long time in American politics. Hillary Clinton was ahead by about this much 2 weeks before the American election, and then the James Comey press announcement came, and other things happened, and the polls were off. So, we don't know that there'll be a Biden landslide. If there's a Biden landslide, I think there is a good chance that President Trump will not concede election. He won't say Joe Biden's the winner. I congratulate him. He's much more likely to say something like the election was rigged. It was stolen by the use of fraudulent absentee ballots, claims he's been making consistently that are not backed by any evidence whatsoever. But if Trump is trounced, then I think that Republicans will quickly want him to move out of the way. And it probably will mean that they will lose control of the United States Senate. They already don't have control of the United States House, and Democrats are expected to keep control of the United States House. What would happen, I think, is something similar to what happened in Kentucky in 2019, when the incumbent Republican governor, Matt Bevin, was losing to the Democrat and claimed voter fraud and tried to get the state legislature to declare him the winner and take the power away from voters. And after it was clear that Bevin didn't have any evidence of this, Republicans coalesced around accepting the election results. And I think that's what's most likely to happen if there's a Biden blowout. There'll be a lot of thoughts and finger pointing as to what went wrong with Trump with this kind of election. The third possibility, and the one that literally keeps me up at night, is that we have a very close election in the Electoral College, that it comes down to a state like Pennsylvania, which has a history of problems with election administration, where the pandemic is making election administration that much harder to accomplish, because it's not just about the fact that there's more mail-in balloting. It's harder to conduct in-person voting as well. Congress was asked to allocate more money to help states deal with the increased costs of running election during the pandemic, and Congress didn't do so. It was blocked by the Republicans. So what could it look like if the election is very close? Trump could declare victory early on. Now, because Trump has been making so many comments about the election being stolen or rigged, and that mail-in balloting is especially suspicious, it looks like many of his supporters are planning on voting in person, while many Democrats and others are voting by mail. In many states, the mail-in ballots will be counted later, especially in places like Pennsylvania. And so you could easily imagine a situation where Trump is ahead on election night, and ultimately, when all the votes are counted, he's the loser. We've seen this situation before. For example, in Arizona in 2018, the Republican McSally was ahead in the US Senate race on election night. By about a week later, Sinema, the Democrat, won that election. We had 7 congressional races in California in 2018 that followed the same pattern. Democrats tend to vote by mail later, and so we tend to see this blue shift where we start with a Republican lead and it ends up being a Democratic victory. So if Trump tries to declare a victory in a very close election, and it comes down to a state like Pennsylvania, there is a real concern that not only might he litigate, but there could be confrontations in the streets. It could be destabilizing in the United States. These are concerns until the last few years, I've never had about the United States. I thought of it as a very stable American democracy, but it's clear that beneath the surface, there is a lot of discord and a lot of anger. Both sides see this as an existential election where if the other side wins, it means the end of America as we know it. And, so it creates a very volatile situation. There's a lot of concern about even how voting will take place at polling places and make sure that everything is peaceful. In that protracted period, we could end up with lawsuits over the counting of certain absentee ballots. Those lawsuits could end up in the United States Supreme Court. And in kind of the final twist, the United States Supreme Court now has 8 members. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of the court's liberals, has died, shifting the 5-4 conservative liberal balance on the court to a 5-3 balance. Yesterday, the Chief Justice sided with the 3 liberals in creating a deadlock on a question about modestly extending the deadlines for the receipt of ballots in Pennsylvania. But the 4-4 vote shows that if Amy Coney Barrett, who's been nominated for the United States Supreme Court position, is confirmed to that position, she could well be a deciding vote if there is a split on the court over how to deal with a after-election ballot dispute. That's really one of the nightmare scenarios, which I really hope we don't see. One of the things we say in the United States is the election administrator's prayer, which is, Lord, let this election not be close, because when it's close, you can have all kinds of problems with how, you can see all the kinds of problems with how our elections are run. When it's not close, then it is much more likely that we see a successful election, not because we did things right, but because nobody cares, because we have a clear winner. And on that happy note, let me turn it back to you, Leslie.
Okay. Yeah, on that happy note. So let me ask you a question, and then I'll quickly come to the audience because there are a lot of people already with their hands up. Can you tell me, I mean, you said, first of all, 2 weeks is a long time in US politics, and we do know the James Comey story from 2016. But, when a lot of the pollsters, when we're following them, those of us who are not pollsters, but, we follow Nate Silver, we follow the Cook Political Report, et cetera. I mean, it seems like a very large gap right now. What is your read on, is there any way of reading turnout apart from, it looks like maybe a lot of people are turning out, but do you have any read on the partisan differences in the turnout? Can you say a little bit more also about, how widespread is voter suppression and maybe comparative, relative to the last presidential election? And then also, beyond Pennsylvania, for those of us who are going to be sitting on the edge of our seats through the night, and for us, it is through the night, even if there's not going to be a result immediately. Obviously, we're going to watch Florida, but after Florida, where should we be casting our eyes? Where should we be watching? Guess maybe you could give us a quick rundown of the order, just a brief. And apart from Pennsylvania, what states are you most worried about?
Sure. There's a lot there. Let me first give the caveat that I'm not a polling expert. So you all are as competent as I am in looking at that. What I'd say is that Biden has maintained a steady national lead. And if we were running a popular vote, I don't think there's any question that Biden would be the prohibitive favorite for election. The problem is we run this electoral college system. I saw, polls in Pennsylvania are tightening to about 4 points where they were larger. The poll that came out in Florida, that was 1 point. The poll that came out in Arizona, that was 1 point. These are all states that could potentially be pivotal. If Trump loses in those 3 Midwestern states that he narrowly won in 2016, that would be Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and it doesn't seem close in Michigan or Wisconsin right now, then he really would have to run the table. He had a very narrow path for victory. But the polls in the battleground states are the ones that are the most relevant. And that polling is sometimes harder to do. And there hasn't been that much of it in some places. So if you're asking me if I'm confident of a Biden victory, I'm not. I think it's more likely than not, but certainly not anything that's for sure. So that's where the polling is. And I had a piece at CNN about these three scenarios that I can put a link to in the chat box that links to an analysis that was done by an actual polling expert, Harry Enton at CNN, who showed how Biden could lose in the Electoral College even while having 5 million more votes than Trump. So that's why it's so complicated. And that's why just looking at the Biden is ahead by 11 poll that we saw this morning, it doesn't tell us enough. Still more likely that Biden wins, but not by a tremendous amount. Okay, on the question of voter suppression, let me back up and explain what that even means and why it's an issue in the United States. So I would say that the Republican Party divided after the 2012 election when Mitt Romney lost to Barack Obama. They conducted a so-called autopsy to figure out what was wrong with the party. And those who wrote this report for the Republican National Committee suggested that the party needed to move more towards the center. It needed to appeal more towards to women, to minority voters, to make the tent bigger. So there's one wing of the party. I think of it more as the George W. Bush wing, or the Romney wing, compassionate conservatism. That's the party that is derided as rhinos by the other side, Republicans in name only. The Trumpian wing or the Tea Party wing would be those who are relying on a wider, older, more rural set of voters to get elected. And if that's your strategy, and that's clearly the Trump strategy in this election, we see him appealing to his base and doing little more than that. If that is the strategy, then I think that's a good explanation for why we're seeing laws and litigation positions of Republicans in many states that make it harder for people to register and to vote. So even during the pandemic, we're seeing Republicans oppose many efforts that make it easier to register and vote. And some of these efforts were allowed in the primary when it wasn't Democrat versus Republican and are being rolled back in the general election. I think that says a lot. It's hard to quantify how much these laws like show an identification before you can vote, or cutting back the number of days of early voting, or making you get a witness signature if you're going to turn an absentee ballot. It's hard to quantify how much these laws actually affect voter outcomes. I think in many ways that's the wrong question to ask. The question we should be asking is, why does the state get to make it harder for people to register and vote? And if the answer is because of voter fraud, the amount of voter fraud in the United States is very rare. Despite the claims of the president, just about every day, the evidence is that our elections are very clean in the United States, that these instances tend to be isolated, and especially in a large election, they would be easily caught. So I think Democrats often tend to exaggerate the extent to which voter suppression is driving outcomes. It becomes a political issue for both parties. So voting has not only become something that's important in terms of how the election is conducted, it's become a political issue up there with climate change and immigration and Black Lives Matter and everything else. People are seeing the fight over voting rights as part of the struggle for the control of the country. And so there's a lot of exaggeration that comes in on the Democratic side about the extent to which this is affecting outcomes. I think there are a lot of steps that are taken in response to Republican attempts to make it harder to register and vote, which tend to neutralize these measures. That doesn't mean these measures are justified. In many cases, they're not, but it does mean that, you know, trying to attribute, for example, let's take a very concrete example. Hillary Clinton has claimed that it was because of Wisconsin's voter ID law that she lost in 2016 in Wisconsin. And I think that claim has not been proven. And it becomes a very easy, sloppy way for Democrats to explain away their losses, rather than the fact that maybe they didn't campaign hard enough for African-American votes in the state of Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania during the 2016 election.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to turn immediately to Adam Isaacs. Adam, if you unmute yourself and go ahead and speak your question, Adam, and then we'll come to Aidan Cross.
Thank you very much. found that very interesting. I work in the European Parliament in our transatlantic relations unit, and last year we had a talk about DC getting statehood. And I was just wondering if the Democrats do sweep the board and get the Senate as well as the White House, whether they'll move to address some of the problems caused with the Electoral College and the problems of being able to win the popular vote but lose on the Electoral College by adding 2 states, DC and Puerto Rico. And if they did, would that actually help them in the long term? Thank you.
Right. So one of the questions, if Democrats take control of the Congress, both houses of Congress and the presidency, would they pass election reforms? And there certainly would be a lot of pressure for them to do so. There are 2 big impediments to passing election reforms in the United States, even if we do see that constellation of a Democratic House, Democratic Senate, and a Democratic president. Number 1, there's a rule called the filibuster, which allows anyone in the Senate to block a measure from passing with 41 votes. So it takes, out of 100 votes, it takes 60 votes rather than 50 votes to pass something. So Democrats would likely have to blow up the filibuster in order to do that. I've argued, I had a piece in Slate in 2018 arguing that Democrats should do just that. So one impediment to election reform is the filibuster. The second is the United States Supreme Court and the federal courts more generally, which, thanks to Trump's ability to appoint many judges, is stacked against liberal ideas. And so a lot of the legislation that might be proposed could be struck down as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. That's why you're hearing Democrats talking about adding justices to the Supreme Court's so-called court packing because of this concern about this. Now, I do think that on the question of admitting DC and Puerto Rico to the into the union as states, so we'd have 52 states. Each of those would get 2 senators and at least 1 member of Congress. I think that's a possibility. I think the Puerto Rico case is more complicated because it's a US territory where it's not clear that the majority of Puerto Rico residents would want to be a state as opposed to have a different status. It could happen. DC would almost certainly result in 2 more Democratic senators. It could help shift the balance of power in the Senate. Puerto Rico has a history of electing Republicans. Things might change if it became a US state, and it might become a reliable Democratic state, but the politics there look somewhat different. Doing that, adding those, would not change the Electoral College very much. DC already gets votes in the Electoral College. So if you added Puerto Rico and it added 3 to the Democratic column, that would moderately help. To get Electoral College reform, the most likely path would be through a constitutional amendment that would require a vote of 2/3 of each House of Congress, which seems extremely unlikely, as well as ratification by 3/4 of the US states. That seems very unlikely because the battleground states and the smaller states that think they benefit from the Electoral College would not want to do that. So I'm not optimistic about Electoral College reform. I am optimistic about other things that could be done. For example, I've suggested we have national nonpartisan election administration, and Congress would have the power to set that up. Congress could pass laws dealing with minimum standards for conducting voting. It could limit gerrymandering. There's lots of things Congress would be able to do if it got rid of the filibuster. Some of that would be potentially blocked by a Supreme Court. Some of it would be able to be successful.
Thank you for raising the question about gerrymandering too. Can I just clarify one thing on that? So the gerrymandering, the redistricting takes place at state level, but you could have Congress could pass a law is what you're proposing?
So there's gerrymandering that is that relates to congressional seats, and Congress has the power under Article 1, Section 4 of the United States Constitution to set any rules over states for the conduct of congressional elections. So states ordinarily set the rules for congressional elections, but Congress can override that. And so that's where that comes from. It would be a harder thing for Congress to set rules for state and local elections. Congress might claim its power to enforce the 14th Amendment, for example. I think that would be on much shakier legal ground, but there's no question, and the Supreme Court even said it in a recent case called Rucho versus Common Cause, that Congress could pass redistricting reform that applies to Congress, that applies to congressional races around the country.
Thank you. That's very helpful, especially for our audiences. Aidan Cross, you're next. If you unmute yourself.
Hello, I'm a student currently studying US politics, and one of the questions we had to discuss was about the presidential electoral system and whether it needed reform. So my question is, what can we learn from, what do you think we could learn from the 2020 election about what reforms we may need to pursue, or the US needs to pursue?
So I think that the pandemic really demonstrated that the protection for American voting rights under the American Constitution is very weak. As I started off, we have this polarized, fragmented election process. And even during a pandemic, people are having to sue and try and find some way to deal with the problems of voting. And I think we need a constitutional amendment that would guarantee the right to vote. I mean, in fact, the Supreme Court 20 years ago in the Bush versus Gore case, which was a case that ended the disputed 2000 election, told us that state legislatures maintain the power to choose the presidential electors for their state directly. And it's only because by grace that state legislatures have given voters the power to choose to vote for president. And state legislatures can take back that power. So in 2024, if a state legislature decides we're not going to hold a vote for president, we're just going to pick the electors for our state directly, the Constitution allows that. That shows me a kind of a flaw in the Constitution. And so I favor a recognition of an affirmative right to vote in the Constitution, and also an amendment that would establish national nonpartisan election administration like they have in the UK and in Australia, Canada, Germany. You pick your advanced democracy. We are the outlier in the United States. And it would also impose certain minimal standards that states would have to meet in state and local elections. I wrote an article, I'll also put that in the chat box, called 3 Pathologies of American Voting Rights Illuminated by the COVID-19 Pandemic and How to Treat and Cure Them, which makes the case that if we can't protect voting rights even during a pandemic, we're doing a pretty bad job of things, and we need to think about more radical change. And I've been someone who's been strongly opposed to proposing constitutional amendments because I think that's generally a hollow thing. But now I think it needs to become a national, perhaps generational movement on this question of protecting voting rights. I think that's the biggest problem that we have.
Thank you for that. I'm going to read one question from Achim. The question is, given that often party-aligned county chiefs are in charge, what is the risk of many votes being thrown out on grounds that might be spurious? Republicans are already not hesitant to suppress voting in areas where they expect to do badly, so could votes be declared invalid without due scrutiny?
So I do think that there's some concern for local election administration. In the United States, things are much more transparent than they were, say, 20 or 30 years ago. At the time of Bush versus Gore, I think people are paying attention to these things. And so, for example, one of the problems that I mentioned earlier is that absentee ballots are being rejected because voters are not following the rules. Talked about those naked ballots. Sometimes they're being rejected because someone has said that a signature on a ballot doesn't match the signature that appears on a government record, like a motor vehicle record. That gives some discretion. Many states have proposed rules that deal with how you're supposed to do signature matching, and everybody's watching for these kinds of problems. So I do think that while it's possible that there will be some places where there will be issues with local counting of the ballots, and we know that in, for example, Gwinnett County in Georgia, African-American voters are having a much harder time having their ballots accepted than white voters. People are on the lookout for this, and I do think that it is potentially an issue that in a very close election could end up being litigated. But for the most part, I think most election officials are trying to do a good job and trying to do a fair job under what are admittedly very difficult circumstances right now.
So before I come to Tom's question, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about Pennsylvania. How quickly, you've written a blog on it. You obviously have looked at it very carefully. We've had you've talked about the naked ballot ruling, the recent Supreme Court decision, but how quickly would it come down to Pennsylvania? And if one was just looking at it from the outside, it might just seem like it's just a question of, it takes a bit longer. President Trump gets a bit frustrated and does what he's been doing for a while, which is saying that, there's fraud surrounding mail-in ballots. But, there's a lot of noise maybe for an extra few days or for a week. But so what? Shouldn't we eventually get to an answer? But I gather you think it's much more complicated than that.
Well, it might be. It really, everything comes down to the margin. If Pennsylvania is not crucial for the Electoral College, then despite the problems they have and the delays they may have, we're not going to focus national attention on it. So, in that sense, it's, it could be nothing to worry about this time around and we'll dodge a bullet. But Pennsylvania has 20 Electoral College votes. Of the 3 Midwestern states that Trump won in 2016, it's the one where he's the closest. It's the one that has a long history of poor election administration, especially in Philadelphia. And I could say much of the same things about Michigan. And the only reason I'm less worried about Michigan is because the polling is not as close. It's not as though I think Michigan does a better job. I spent a lot of time in Election Meltdown talking about the disasters and trying to do a recount in Detroit in 2016, how terrible their election administration was. I think they've gotten things a little better in both states from 2016, but what's happened since 2020 is we had all of this dislocation because of the pandemic. So in Pennsylvania, about a quarter of election administrators in the state have quit. And so, there's concern about competence. I'm not talking about fraud or people stealing elections. I'm talking about basic competence and being able to get ballots out to people and being able to have them fairly and accurately and quickly counted. Best case scenario is that it's going to be such a blowout that we're not going to care. But it's going to take, I think, a week to 2 weeks before the bulk of the ballots are going to be counted. And in part, the reason for that is that Pennsylvania is one of the states that allows anyone who wants to vote by mail. That's a new rule that came into effect this year, pre-COVID, but this year. But it's one of the few states that does not allow the so-called pre-canvassing of absentee ballots. That is, when an absentee ballot comes in, an absentee ballot, postal ballot, mail-in ballot, I'm using all these terms interchangeably. When an absentee ballot comes in, it has to be checked to make sure that it's legitimate. You have to check the signature, everything complies. In some states, there's a barcode that needs to be scanned to make sure it matches the voter information. All of these anti-fraud protections are there. Pennsylvania is not allowing any pre-canvassing of these ballots, which means that they're going to start on election day. In contrast, in California and Florida, they're starting weeks before. And so that is gives a head start, and that makes it much more likely that a larger chunk of the votes will be available within a day of the election. Now, I'm not sure how things go in the UK in national elections, but I do know in Canada, they're able to announce national results that evening. And the reason for that is this really one thing on the ballot. You're voting for your party and that's it. Is it the Liberals or the Conservatives or the Quebecers or whoever? It's not, in California, I think I voted on more than 50 things, literally. And so it took that between candidates and ballot measures and local races and all of that, it takes a long time to get all of that counting done, especially in a place like Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is also a place where the president has claimed there's a lot of fraud. It's where he has a number of political operatives. It is it is, along with North Carolina, a case that has a Democratic-dominated state Supreme Court and a Republican-dominated state legislature. And that combination means you could see in any post-election litigation the state Supreme Court issuing rulings that might help to allow the counting of ballots, and the Republican legislature objecting and saying that under the Constitution, we have the power to decide what the rules are for the conduct of the election. This was the very issue that went up to the Supreme Court in that case that was decided yesterday on an emergency basis. And that's where the Supreme Court divided 4-4, and where a new justice on the court could be the tie-breaking vote that might side with the Republican legislature over the Democratic state Supreme Court. So that's a big part of my reason for worry.
Okay, I'm going to read Tom's question, and then we'll turn to Eddie to ask his question. Tom writes, do you think that there is any possibility at all that Trump could win the popular vote? And he also writes, could recent revelations about Hunter Biden significantly erode Biden's lead? Do you have an answer for that?
Yeah, so now that's, again, getting a little bit out of my area. I specialize in election law. So just like I'm not a pollster, I'm not kind of a political prognosticator, but let me just say, the polls would have to be way off. Most of the polls are showing a Biden lead in the popular vote of somewhere between 8 and 11 points. For Trump to make that up in the last 2 weeks, barring, it's 2020, who knows what happens in the next 2 weeks. There's an asteroid that might hit the Earth the day before the election. Seriously, we've heard all these things, so who knows? But I would be very surprised, unless there's some shock to the system, of how Trump could beat Biden in the popular vote. The Hunter Biden story seems to not be resonating very much. One of the things about this election is that it's been remarkably stable, and Trump's approval has been remarkably stable, and Joe Biden's popularity has been stable. And much of the latest Hunter Biden material is being covered in the press, not as about Hunter Biden, but as about an effort by Russians to plant disinformation through Rudy Giuliani and going to a tabloid newspaper in New York to try to get it picked up when even Fox News wouldn't pick it up. And so among the Republican base, there's lots of talk about Hunter Biden. It's hard to see how, in the midst of this pandemic and with a president who is so controversial that people in the United States love him or they hate him, it's hard to see. There's really not a lot of middle ground. It's hard to see how something like the potential problems that the opponent candidate's son may have had is going to move the needle very much at all.
Eddie, let me come to you. And let me just say again, if you do have questions, please be sure to either write your name in the chat function or to raise your hand. But Eddie, if you want to go ahead and unmute.
Good. Sorry, yes, thank you very much indeed. I'm just wondering, what, in a worst case scenario, how long do you think it will be until we know who has won? And what does the Constitution have to say about this?
Worst case scenario, that's hard to say. So let me start with what the Constitution has to say. If on January 20th, 2021, we have not had the Congress choose the president from the counting of the Electoral College votes, President Trump is no longer president, and instead we go by the rules of succession, which would probably make Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic US House Speaker, the temporary president until this is worked out. I don't think that's very likely. I don't think it would go that long. There are possibilities of electoral college ties, and there's all kinds of things that can happen if there are electoral college ties, including having the Congress vote, the Congress vote where each state gets one vote. These are provisions that are set forth in the 12th Amendment. There can be disputes that we had an election like this in 1876 in the United States, the Hayes-Tilden election, and they formed a commission, and the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court ended up being on the commission, and it ended up becoming a political deal where the Republican was allowed to become the president, but had to withdraw troops from the South after the Civil War, which ended Reconstruction and allowed for white supremacy and the depression of African-American voting rights for a century. So they're pretty bad worst case scenarios, but more realistically, the idea under the Constitution and the federal statutes is that states have 5 weeks to complete their counting before electors meet, and then a week later before the Electoral College votes are due, and then we have a few more weeks after that to the beginning of January, where Congress meets to count those votes and resolves any disputes. So there is this potential multi-week period where there could be recounts or disputes. In 2000, which is our most recent contested presidential election, it took 36 days from the day of the election until Al Gore conceded after the United States Supreme Court stopped the recounting of votes in Florida, and George W. Bush was declared the winner in that Florida election. So a lot of ifs. I should say that you shouldn't listen to me and think that what I'm saying is likely. I analogize myself to an engineer who works at a nuclear power plant, whose job it is to think about all the ways that the reactor could melt down and all the things we could do to prevent that meltdown. So I'm dealing with low probability, highly catastrophic events that I'm trying to think about and prevent.
Okay, we have a question from Jeremy Ross, and he wants me to read it out. He's having a problem with his mic. He says, how come the US cannot achieve a consensus to review and amend the Constitution? I know you told us a little bit about, what that takes to have a constitutional amendment, but maybe you could say a little bit more about just generally why it's such a, it is, if you're looking at America from outside of America, it's sometimes quite perplexing. Not least if you live in a country that doesn't have a constitution.
Yes, right. The unwritten Constitution. Yeah. Well, we haven't had a successful constitutional amendment passed in decades in the United States, in part because we're so polarized, and it takes a supermajority in both Congress and in the state legislatures in order for something to pass. Something like electoral college reform, there would be losers. A state like Pennsylvania would get a lot less attention. If you were a candidate running for president, you'd spend a lot of time in California, New York, Florida, Texas, where all the voters are, right? The bigger population states. And so if you're a swing state or you're a small state, you might think you'd get a lot less attention than you would under the other system. And the other fact is that the Electoral College in recent decades has tended to benefit Republicans. And so there's now a partisan valence to this, which there wasn't. So there's a movement in the United States called the National Popular Vote. And the idea is to form an agreement or compact among states making up at least 270 electoral college votes, that each of those states would pledge that their votes would go to not to who won in that state, but to who won in the electoral college. They're not that far off from being able to get enough states representing 270 votes. They're a few medium-sized states away, but every state that's signed up to do this is a democratic state, because this is seen, and I should say there are serious constitutional problems with this measure. It's not clear to me that it would be permissible. But I'm pointing it out not because I think it's going to happen, but because I think it illustrates how this too has become enmeshed in US partisan politics. You do not have Republican states that are on board with this. And in fact, Republicans are actively working against it. So the fact that you can have an election where up to 5 million people could support the second choice candidate, that's only possible because the Electoral College. And so I think Republicans see it as being to their advantage right now.
It does seem like an advantage, just looking at it from the outside looking in.
Yes.
Christian Rauch has a question. Christian, if you unmute yours.
Yeah, this is a more general question. It's in the case of a narrow outcome, especially a narrow Biden win. what is the potential for violence, which you referred to, being national and coordinated rather than local and sporadic?
Really hard to tell. We have seen a few instances of violence in the United States. One of the things that worries me the most is that Trump has said that if there were protests against his victory, that he would put them down very quickly. Don't know what that would look like. We say a narrow Biden win. If Trump is claiming victory in a narrow situation where it goes, say, to the United States Supreme Court, which issues a decision that splits along party lines, then I really think that could erupt in unrest in the United States. I think there would be a tremendous sense of a stolen election on the part of the left. If something like that happened where Biden was ahead and Trump was declared the winner. If Biden actually is found to be the winner, a lot, I think, is going to depend on whether there is responsible Republican leadership in the United States, aside from Trump, and whether the party is going to double down on Trump if he narrowly loses, or they're going to try to abandon him and try to move forward. Part of the problem in the United States is because we have this first past the post voting system. It's very hard for third parties to emerge. If we had third parties, it really seems like we're in a moment where the Republican Party would be splintering between the kind of the right-wing nativist populists representing the Trump side and the kind of more socially moderate, fiscally conservative Republicans, many of whom have at least temporarily fled to the Democratic Party because they're unhappy with Trump on a number of issues. It's really hard to say. I certainly hope that our election goes smoothly. It's why I've said that it would be better for the country if we don't have a close election in the Electoral College and there's a clear winner, because that will that kind of clarity will provide less of a hook for people who might want to claim something that would destabilize the country. They'd have less of a hook to convince people that the election was being run in an illegitimate way. That was the whole point of my book, Election Meltdown, which I wrote before the pandemic, but the points apply very much through the pandemic, which is that we have a number of reasons that American confidence in election legitimacy has been decreasing, and that we really need to take steps to fundamentally alter how we run our elections so that more people will be confident that their votes will be fairly and accurately counted.
It's interesting what you say, because, this question of if it was narrow and Trump, wasn't willing to concede, what would the Republicans do? But, the obvious issue is that there's a collective action. There's sort of a public good / collective action problem. Who's the first leader? How do you get the Republicans, even if there were enough Republicans that wanted to come together and call him to account? How does that work? That's, that's a very tricky calculation to make. And we haven't yet seen any visible evidence coming out of the Republican Party that there's that level of coordination amongst those who might be quietly reluctant supporters or opposed to the president. So,
well, let me push back on that. We did have a few senators this weekend say negative things about Trump, which is rare for them. We also saw Republican senators very quickly shoot down the idea that Trump floated a few months ago of delaying the election, which is a power that Trump does not have under the Constitution. We also saw Republicans quickly come and say, of course, we'll have a peaceful transition of power. We're going to have a successful election. So that was a little bit of pushback, not a tremendous amount, but I think a lot's going to fall on Mitch McConnell and how things are going to look there. We didn't talk about this possibility, but small possibility that Trump could lose the election. That Trump could win the election, but lose control of the Senate, and then the kind of stalemate that we might see, and the sort of partisan lack of cooperation would be even greater than what we've had if both houses of Congress were Democrats. Now, Trump always portrays himself as a deal maker. Maybe he'd be ready to make a deal with Nancy and Chuck, but I wouldn't count on that. There's just all kinds of constellations of things. But I think, I don't want to overstate it. I don't want to be an alarmist. I think the risk of, I like how the questioner put it, kind of concentrated violence is unlikely. The risk of sporadic violence is there, but I think people are on the lookout for this. People are aware of this, and everyone's very sensitive to the need to maintain, a fair and orderly administration of our elections.
So we have 3 questions. I'm going to try and get them all in and then let you answer them, since we only have a few minutes left. So we'll go to Courtney Rice, and then Catherine Rains, and then Robert Gardner. So Courtney, if you go ahead.
Great, thank you, Leslie. And Professor, thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. It's been really insightful. I'm Courtney Rice. I'm manager with the US and the Americas program at Chatham House. It's been a privilege this evening. My question relates to Christians quite closely, actually. Who actually decides, and at what level, whether it be the state, federal level, who can be election observers? I know there's concerns about intimidation at the election booth, at the polls, whether that's via groups which make me remember instances, I wasn't alive then, so remember's not the right word, but of civil rights movement and the like. So who actually makes those decisions as to who can turn up and stand by and hand out leaflets or try to intimidate voters? Is that at the state or federal level?
So there are, let me take all 3 questions.
No, you can go ahead and answer that, and then we'll get Catherine and Rob.
Yeah, I'll answer this quickly. That there are federal laws that prevent intimidation of voters, but rules for where voters, where observers can stand and what protesters can do is primarily state law. And again, these things differ from state to state. In most states, you can't just go into a polling place and watch what's going on without having gone through some training and agreeing to certain ground rules.
Okay, Catherine, and then Robin. Catherine Rains.
Yes, thank you very much. You've talked about how long it could take to get a definitive result. And so I guess we're all going to be glued to the media for weeks. But given that voting and counting both take place over such a protracted period, what's the role for exit polling? Is that allowed, and how accurate is it in the States, and what happens with that?
So exit polling is allowed under the First Amendment. We can't stop exit polling. It's not like in Canada where they have a kind of a blackout before. Our First Amendment protection of speech is very strong, and we couldn't have that. I think a lot of people think the exit polling is not going to be accurate as a predictor of election outcomes, in great part because the electorate's going to look very different this time. That is, a lot of people are going to be voting by mail. We don't know what the rates are going to be of voting by mail. And so it's very hard to extrapolate scientifically from a sample that you might get at a polling place as to what the actual electorate looks like. The in-person voting in many places may skew Republican, but the overall voting, counting the absentee ballots, may skew Democratic.
And final question from Robin Gardner.
Can you hear me, Leslie?
Yes, Robert, thank you.
Professor, can you spend a few moments just describing the Lincoln Project, how influential it might be, and what is the makeup of this group?
So the Lincoln Project is it's a political group that is formed by some of the major Republican never-Trumpers. These are people who were Republican political operatives and campaign people who've rebelled against Donald Trump and who have left the Republican Party. And they've been running a lot of ads. I think those ads are very, liberals love to see those ads. They get a lot of attention on political Twitter. I don't know how much they're affecting, voting in the States. I know they run a lot of their ads in DC, so Trump can see them. I think they get into his head, and maybe that has more of an effect than their actual advertising. But I'm not familiar enough to know the extent of what they're doing to know if they're actually making a dent on the ground, say in states with close U.S. Senate races.
This has been tremendous. You've given us an extraordinary amount of, in addition to an overview and also a very granular view, you've given us a huge amount of just detailed knowledge. The United States, as you well know, but certainly looking at it from outside the United States, is phenomenally complex. And you've certainly illuminated it in a way that's very accessible, given the very high level of complexity. So we're very grateful, not least because, as you can tell, how many people would in America would dial in to the nth call on the British elections? Certainly not, this number at this time of night. So I think that it speaks both to your very well-known contributions and to the significance that we all are giving to this particular election. So thank you so much for your time. It's really been great.
It was my pleasure.
And it's recorded, so we will share the recording with all of you. And thank you so much to our audience for turning up. And in 2 weeks' time, tell us where you will be so that we can be following you. Presumably blogging, or will you also be speaking?
You'll find me probably on CNN because I have a contract with them through the election.
Okay. We will look for you on CNN. We will follow your blog, and we hope that you'll return to Chatham House.
Sure. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thanks.